This is Real Talk, the customer insights show with Jenn Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen on all major podcast channels. Join Jenn and her guests for a weekly discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Real Talk is presented to you by VoxPopMe, the leader in video research and ranked number 1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm Jenn Vogel, and today I want to talk about communicating results. Why that can be hard, why it's necessary to communicate. As today's guest has said, it's crazy how useless all that customer research is if it's not in the hands of the people making decisions. Today, I'm joined by Hannah Shamji, a customer research consultant, to dive into the subject. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and especially to chat about this topic. I love that it's coming into the light. So thank you so much for having me. I'm stoked.
Absolutely. I'm really excited. We talk a lot about the different ways to capture research or considerations and how-tos. And I think that that communication piece, that socializing it and doing something with it is a really key part of the topic. So I'm excited to dive in.
Me too.
Awesome. So to get us started, can you tell us a bit about your career and how you got started in the industry?
Yeah, I have been a qualitative researcher for, about 10 years now. It kind of shocks me to say that it's been like an entire decade of essentially people research, whether that's customers or doctors or patients. I also have a background in psychology and counseling, so really understanding kind of the person side, the person behind the customer or the user, and then used my qualitative research in healthcare and psych, which was very like academic. So really in the rigor of research, which is great, but also you don't really end up seeing the results, right? Like you're stuck in the weeds and doing the research, but you don't actually see the implementation side. In the past few years, I moved into marketing. So now really diving into customer research and as well as some background in copywriting. I really come at this from like two prongs, right? So one, the rigor of the research, but then two, can we actually use this? It's not just like sitting somewhere, it's actually being communicated and useful. So those are the real kind of double sides that I'm bringing. So a lot of like little pieces that have pulled me into this space of understanding the person, understanding the research, and then understanding how the research and the insights are useful and actionable for whoever's using them. So a nice little triangle all across this tight little decade here of experience.
That's amazing. And I think it's really interesting to move. I hear a lot of people moving from marketing into research, but this might be the first time on this show that we've talked about somebody with a research background moving into a marketing role, which I think is so valuable because obviously like as marketers, we need all of that information. I mean, and you said like now you're able to think about what can we do with this research we're doing and the information we're capturing. Do you think that's the biggest difference between doing research as a marketer as opposed to what you've done and on the more academic side of things?
It's a good question. I definitely think that the timestamp, like the timeline of research is very different. So the research happens a lot in academia, but then the implementation and use of it is really slow. Research happens a lot more quickly in marketing, but then the implementation isn't as robust. So people might do all of this research, but is it actually used, or it kind of just like lives in everyone's head who've done the research? And so there's a bit of a severance there in terms of like doing it and not necessarily doing it perhaps with the right rigor. I think there's a lot of buzz and momentum around like talking to your customers, engaging your users, which is great. But sometimes there can be a false sense of productivity of doing it at the wrong time or at a time where it's actually less productive or not asking the right questions without that planning. So the tee up is a little different, and then the actual implementation is different in both worlds. But it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition,
Mm.
like how differently they do and use research in both of those spaces for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so important to like kind of clearly identify the objectives. And obviously in a more academic setting, right? Like that's a part of the process, but if you're just focused on, oh, let's talk to our customers. Yes, we can do more of that. We can do that quickly. There's a lot of, technology and methodologies that allow you to do that quickly. But if it's not done with the outcome in mind, I can see how it just sits and maybe doesn't get implemented the way you would want it to.
Yeah, and I think that it's like capitalizing on that momentum is so
Mhm.
great. Like it's amazing when people are like, we want to talk to the user, we want to get in front of the customer. But yeah, that can feel like that's the goal, and it's not the goal, right? The goal is what you do with that, what you learn from the customer. So a unpopular opinion there is it's not just about talking, it's what do you want to do? And where are the gaps in what you know, and what you don't, so that you can turn to your customers to figure that out. I always kind of wave a flag of like talking to customers is not a good goal, because it just sort of changes the trajectory. It shifts the focus out from research and more to the actual method, which is a step in that kind of insights collection process, which feels really nitty gritty and granular. But like you said, it's all about outcomes, right? Like, can we actually make sure this research is useful from the jump? Because if it isn't, all of that time spent is just wasted.
I love that so much, that talking to the customer is not the goal. Because I actually have heard that is the goal a lot. There's a lot of companies that have goals in place for people of all different, divisions and cross-functionally.
Hmm.
Like the goal is you need to talk to X amount of customers per week or per month. And I always thought that was great, that companies are that customer centric, that they're putting goals around customer conversations. But when you frame it the way you just did, it's, I mean, so much more powerful, because you've got to be able to do something with those conversations. It's not just the conversation itself that's the goal. So I love what you just said about that. And this is a good segue into, our topic today about communication. Like, why is it so important? Why is this such an important topic, when we're thinking about communicating the results of that research or those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, like, the question is such a core piece, right? Like there literally is no point if the research is just going to sit in like a digital drive, right? Like on Google Drive. It has absolutely no value if it can't funnel into your decisions. If it's not used by the team, if one person has it and nobody else does, it just doesn't have the life or the longevity. And then you end up needing to redo it, or someone else on the team does it because they didn't know you had it. Communicating the results is the whole thing. If you can't, you just end up being this little silo of, I know some stuff, but nobody else knows those things. So how far can that insight actually go? Um, I mean, I was thinking through like how many times I've talked to someone who is like the holder of the data in a company, and there is just this gap of like, well, other people don't even know that I have this information. And so it's a constant effort to find this information, or it's seen as a gap, but it's actually been filled by someone else on the team or another part of the team. Communicating is so critical. So you actually have this like shared foundation that keeps growing. And you're continuing to sharpen your understanding of the customer, but as a team. Like without that team aspect, you've got like tension and kind of competing resources. Your time is not being well spent. The siloed information is just so detrimental. It can actually send you into doing a lot more work than you need to be. So it's really important to kind of tackle this from the jump, right? This isn't like oh, I have research, now what? This is so much in tandem. Like, where's the research going to live? What's going to happen? to create that lifespan. So it's not just a like, let's talk to customers and then poof, and it kind of just, who knows where it lands, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And, I think that so many businesses are really focused on being customer centric right now and, you know, having more conversations with customers. Like it almost seems like a given. Of course, we need to be
Hmm.
talking to each other and sharing the results. But why do you think like so many teams really do struggle with this? And so much research does live in your digital drive with only one person accessing it. Like, why is that? Where do businesses struggle with that communication right now?
It's an important question, and I think the gap is that talking to customers is a very tangible and easy enough part of the research process to get in front of, right? Like if you want insights, the idea of talking is very accessible. Like I can have a conversation, I can set up a conversation. There's not so much friction. There might be nerves and it might be a little bit uncomfortable and new, but it's not necessarily a big question mark. Now, there are areas where it should be because interviewing is absolutely a skill, but that's a separate conversation, so we'll park that. But because it's so accessible, it can kind of feel like that a standalone here. Um, what you do with the research, how many people you speak to, who you speak to, and then how to like collate that information is a little more nebulous. But that starts to feel more in like the research circle, like sample size and methodology. That kind of language is less it's just less accessible and less kind of common and familiar. And so I think what happens is we go for like that quick win, let's talk to customers, or even let's learn X from customers. And then what you do with that, how that lives and moves on is just, it becomes this bit more complex. Like, hey, we've had this goal, we reached this goal, and now I guess we have this information, right? So it's not so much the idea of having the information is not really defined as like making sure everyone has it, having like a single source of customer truth. That's not really considered the priority because of that easy grab of let's just talk to customers, right? So it's the shift in the perspective. It's the fact that the goal is talking as opposed to learning a particular predefined thing. And then suddenly, when you have that shift to learning, it's about everybody learning. So even this idea of like who should be involved in this, whose decision is it to decide like when to do research? When should you even do research? When those questions aren't addressed, you don't end up having a plan for what happens after the fact. When the focus is just let's talk to customers, let's figure this out from customers, your task is really narrow anyways, right? It's not really about having a longer shelf life of research. It's just about this one objective. So it's really, I think the challenge is broadening the scope, like asking bigger questions. Do we need to do research? When, what kind, like who are we talking to? Once you start scoping that out, where's it going to live? What do we really want to use this for? Those bigger kind of core questions are going to drive and remove the struggle of like, oh, okay, we have this research. I don't know where it is, but let's just do it again. Are you going to pull you out of the weeds of the methods and into like this bigger story and narrative that you're trying to fill because the research fits into the business as opposed to this kind of standalone piece? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're basically saying, you know, this conversation that you and I are having now about communicating research results or learnings doesn't start when you've captured the results. This is a
Yeah.
mindset shift in how we think about customer understanding from the get-go. If we're
Mhm.
thinking about, oh, we should definitely run a survey to answer that question, then running the survey is the checkbox. And we all love to check
Yeah.
off our to-do list. But if the objective is to make a decision based on customer feedback, then you might still be running a survey to answer a particular question, but you've not then checked the box. You're not then done.
Yeah.
Um, so it's I'm thinking like, okay, we've got all this data, right? How do we communicate it out? We've learned all this stuff. How do we communicate? But what you're sharing now, it's like that actually starts way earlier in the process. And everybody's got to be thinking about the research that they're doing differently in order to set yourself
Yeah.
up for positive communication.
Oh yeah, 100%. I love that you kind of pulled that out. It is absolutely a conversation that's like, if you're talking about let's do this survey, you're too far down the road. You
Right.
need to like really scale this back. The question is, hey, do we need research here? And that's the question you want to start with. Then from there, it becomes like, you know what it's connected to. What should we do? Who should we talk to? How should we approach this? Those all stem, and then the survey or the interviews are a result. But yes, absolutely. Like that conversation needs to be happening way, way up the road, and be about like, do we need research, right? This is kind of the core, the go-to, that the checkbox should be, did we evaluate if we need research here? Because if we did, then all these pieces are to follow. And if not, we have clarity, right? Like there's a clear decision. Just inherent in that, you're changing the way you're approaching research, right? Like it's tied now to a need or utility or the bigger impact. So absolutely, like shifting where you have that conversation is fundamental.
Yeah. So kind of with that in mind, like what are the steps that teams should take to, in the end, communicate better, get their research in the right hands, make those proper decisions?
Yeah. So I typically follow 4 steps in a research process. The one is first is planning and putting together that strategy. Then you want to dive into actually collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then socializing and sharing the findings. But when you want to tee up correctly, so once you've checked off like, hey, we need research here, then you want to plan like, what kind of research do you need? How are you going to do it? How are you going to analyze it? What do you need this research to do? You can start to think there, even through the format. Like, are you going to put together a slide in a sales deck? Is this going to end up driving messaging for the website, or maybe ads, or which industries you target? If you can get that granular, you can actually envision yourself like you've got the research on one side and you're making a decision referencing that. That's the kind of thinking you want to bring to the table. That's going to help you figure out your planning, because now if I know, hey, I actually want to improve landing page copy for a sign up. Well, now I know I'm kind of looking at leads and getting them to sign up. So I'm not even looking at customers yet. Or if you want to improve sales conversations or understand sales objections, well, now I'm not going to talk to leads necessarily. I'm going to talk to customers who bought and understand that journey.
Mhm.
So you really want to surface that. First step is, do we need research? What for? What decisions do we want the research to drive? Like what do we want to move or change? So because the key piece here with qualitative is you can start to get into the like, oh, let's find out this. Oh, you know what? Actually, while we're there, let's also ask them this. And they become like really nice to knows. And that list will just keep growing, right? But when you lose sight of that anchor of like, right, but what decision are we making? You can create a bit of scope. And that's so important with people research, because it could just explode if you don't have some kind of boundary to it. So what decision do you want to make? Use that to then drive the research. And it will also help you figure out how you're going to communicate it, right? Like, I know copywriters need this. I know decisions for ads need to be there. Well, now you know the specs of the copy page or the ads, and you can make sure you kind of pull the research together to actually meet that need, right? Like now the focus is making that decision, not having that research. And so that shift will help you figure out what you need to do, how you need to prepare it in order to kind of meet that end. Like now it has a business objective, not just a research objective, which is really, really critical.
Mm. Oh, that's such an important distinction, the business objective as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to the research objective. I was giggling when you were talking about like how out of control the questions can get, because especially when you've got a lot of different people involved and you're kind of in a cross-functional team, and like, oh, can we ask them about this? While we have them, let's also ask them about this unrelated thing, because and it all comes from a good place. We just want to better understand the communities we serve, the people that we sell to, the people that use our products and services, but like understanding like that is a question we could ask later in maybe a different conversation or a different methodology, but doesn't help us to solve this business challenge today. That editing, that like pulling back can be really hard. Because we care, right? Like
Yeah.
we want to
Yeah.
know, but it's hard to like be really, really narrow in the scope. And I think identifying those objectives actually really does help with that.
Yeah, like figuring out your priority, like automatically the conversation shifts there, right? It's like very organic now when someone else has, hey, can we also find this out? Now there's a question of like, okay, but is this the same audience? Is it a different audience altogether? Like it changes this now from being talk to customers to doing research to what research do we need based on the decisions that we want to drive. And that becomes such a powerful like North Star in this that you can keep bringing folks back because everyone's aligned on the decisions. The research is where it gets a little foggy, right? Especially with qualitative. So the decisions and keeping them anchored to that. And that doesn't mean that you don't have multiple objectives. It's just you're very clear on A, what the priority is, and B, what those objectives are. And that's going to help you even with the types of questions you ask. It'll bring more focus to those customer conversations or the surveys in a way that is just potent, right? The more specificity you can come to your thinking around the research, the sharper your questions are going to be. And you're going to get really, really close to the answers that you're looking for. So it is this like, take the bigger question and keep funneling down to get that core insight that you're looking for. And so it is that like having that muddy discussion, right? Like, let's figure it out. What are the priorities? What are the objectives? And really kind of honing deeper.
Yeah. And I think too, it helps you like prevent people from being overwhelmed with the amount of information that you get at the end, because, if you get a lot of answers to, like you said, the asking the questions part, that's the easy part. That's the accessible part. And all of a sudden you're left with all these answers to all these different questions. It's like, wait a second, what's the most important finding here? What did I learn that, needs to buzz to the top? And, there's probably a lot of things you've learned from that conversation where you asked a lot of different questions, but it makes the more complicated part of the process even more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, it really, really does. And that what you just said too about like even the asking questions, I found that, early on when I would be asking questions and I wasn't aware of how I was going to use them. And I was like, I want to find out, like, let's take an example of a common one, like pain points. If you don't know how exactly you're going to use that, there are questions that you will have about the pain points you come up with when you move towards making the decision. And you'll think, well, what was the bigger pain point? Yeah, but in what context? Because now you're actually thinking about the decision. And if you merge the two and make it, let me think about what decisions need to be made here, and then what research I would need to make those decisions. Well, now you're not going to have these gaps at the end. It's not going to be like, oh, right, but what was the priority of pain points? And did they also say this? You're going to have the decision kind of matrix ready. And that's going to drive. So you're doing kind of a reverse engineer, right? The research is born out of the business objectives, then to research objectives, then to research questions, then even to interview questions, right? So it's a backwards thing. So you're not going to have any gaps, as opposed to what we normally do, which is talk to customers and then let's see where it gets used, right?
Yeah. Figure out what we're going to do after.
Yeah.
Well, this feels like a really good time for our weekly segment with Vox Popme's VP of Research, Brian Monchine. Today, he's going to share what needs to be included in a research project brief. And I wonder if he's going to offer a bonus life hack for us this week. Let's check it out.
Hey everybody, so today I wanted to talk about the right elements to include within your research project brief. Now, you may be thinking, why do I need a brief? I know what research I need to do. This will just slow me down. Well, just like any great meal, it needs a clear recipe to follow. So consider this your project brief, your research recipe for success. And trust me, even though it's a little bit of extra work, you're going to be thankful that you did it. So before you start, I recommend sitting down with a person or the team that you'll be doing the project for so you can fill this out together. First part of your research brief is going to be your background. So how did the project come up? Who's asking for it? What do we already know about this business question? Next is your project overview and your business objectives. So consider this one level down from the background section where you'll be getting more specific details about the project. So it could be things like what's driving the need for the research? What do we hope to learn? What are 2 to 3 questions that we really need answers to? I see this as a really critical conversation that you want to have early on because in my experience on more than one occasion, after discussing these business objectives with a team who's asking for the research, I was able to answer their questions with information we already had, which eliminated the need to do any additional research. And more importantly, it saved dollars in my budget for any unnecessary work. Okay, so the next section is your intended use of results. What are you going to do with this information? What decisions will be made from it? And which objective criteria will drive that decision? This is an important area where you need to have a very clear understanding of the success measures and any benchmarks you'll be comparing against. The rest of the brief should be pretty easy to complete. You've got your consumer target, which is, are you going to your general population or a certain demographic? What stimulus will be tested, if any? So if you have anything for the consumer to react to, like concepts or ads, find out how many, and then also what design stage they'll be in. So for instance, an ad can be in animatic, a rough, or a finished form. Next is your timeline. When are the results needed? You can use that date to work backwards from to determine when to have a kickoff meeting, when final stimulus needs to be ready, and even create a Gantt chart so it's all in one place. And then finally, identify your project leads. You want to have a really good understanding of who the key contacts are from each team involved, and you can even assign them line items in the Gantt chart so it's clear who owns what. And there you have it, your research recipe for success. And speaking of recipes, here's a good little life hack for you. The next time you're cooking pasta, place a wooden spoon across the top of the pot to keep the water from boiling over. Now you may be asking, why is that? Well, a wooden spoon is hydrophobic, meaning it's unable to absorb water, so it destabilizes the bubbles when they come in contact with it. That's it for me. We'll see you next time.
I can always count on him for such a good life hack. And as an Italian, I can vouch for that to be true. I just didn't know the science behind it. So that's great.
Wow, I'm definitely going to use that. Like my ears kind of super perked up. That's awesome. I love that clip.
And
That was
great.
great.
I just have to say, like, we don't plan Brian's bright ideas to match so perfectly with our conversation, but I mean, what an organic flow into that clip. Like, writing the research brief does not start with the target audience and what questions you're going to ask. I mean, exactly what you were just talking about.
Huge. Like I loved everything kind of he laid out, is so critical, right? And it is this like level of planning that can feel like, oh, do we have to? And it's understanding the pain of like you have that momentum of talking and then it kind of just falls like splat, right? And this is so like I love this, like what's driving the need for the research? What are those measures of success, benchmarks? Like absolutely having that clarity. Because what's really powerful then is the research stops becoming like a thing to do and more like a tool to answer questions. And you put on this radar and the focus is less on let's do research and more on let's have more confidence in this before we go ahead. Let's get more clarity before we set all of our kind of lines on this is our target audience. And the confidence and the clarity become the sort of markers of, well, are we speculating or is this actually validated in the voice of customer? So the research is a tool and a method. It's not the answer, and that shift kind of justifies the planning and putting together that process and that brief, which I loved that. I loved how he spelled everything out there.
Yeah, I did too. And, the intended use, what are we doing with this at the end of all of it? And I thought too, like, just documenting in writing clearly within the research brief, like who are the key people involved and not just who's going to execute the research, but who is it that needs the answer to this question? Because
Yeah.
as we get into talking more about how we're communicating, like understanding your internal audience is going to be crucial also. So if the person who cares about these results is my CFO, I'm probably going to prepare and communicate the results differently than if it's, our head of product or, our CTO, right? Because they're definitely going to care about something a bit different.
Absolutely. Like, and that's so key with the decision, right? Like, what's the need? Where's this going to live? Who's going to use it? And then sit with it and be like, okay, this means X, so let's do this. Exactly as you said, like I do a lot of research it'll be for sales, but then also product, and then also maybe value prop development, right? Like those are very different formats, different mediums, and different pieces that would be highlighted. And we can kind of throw them under like buying journey, buying decision, but there are nuances that are more important to one category and another, right? Like product more on value and aha moments in a particular product, whereas sales more on objections and buying triggers and purchase prompts. So really understanding those nuances, then even going to help you like prepare that differently, right? They're going to look at different things. Their output's going to be different. Does sales just want like what the objections are and how to overcome them? Do they want bullets? Do they want a slide that they can show in a sales call? All of that output's going to change how you prepare and even like analyze and kind of process the data as well.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, this is a great segue. I was going to ask, like, what tips can you offer for teams to like choose what are those nuggets in the research? What are the learnings that you share with the leaders and the stakeholders that care about that project or have been involved?
Yeah, and I think the way to approach this is you always want to look at like what are the core findings that determine everything else. Usually the findings will have some kind of thesis, right? There will be core patterns, core pain points. Maybe it will be, hey, we thought it was mostly this segment that it was our products relevant for, but we actually found out that it's also relevant for this other segment. You want to find the thesis here. And the thing with data is that you can collect all of these pain points, you can collect all of the benefits, but usually you want to look at like the bigger story. What is the data saying to you as a whole? And then how you parse it out for those different uses is a separate piece, but really pulling together the narrative. So looking at, are we targeting the right segment? This is where you're going to come back to your business objectives. Do you have questions around who the right segment is? Do you have questions around your core messaging? What your leading message maybe should be on a sales page? Those are going to be the kind of key findings that you would surface with leadership. The stuff that's like very critical, that they don't need to know that maybe the exact pain points, but they need to know that these pain points are relevant to every single customer across industry. Or they need to know that actually industries are treated differently. Think of the data like a decision tree. What are the top kind of findings that affect all of the others? So the little ones you can kind of ignore, and those would be more relevant for like individual teams. But when you're thinking about leadership, you want to mention those core, like they're usually 3 or 4 critical findings that inform the rest. So that everybody's thinking about this the same way, right? Like everybody's aware of all the pain points are different, all the benefits are different, or no 2 customers are the same, or all of the customers are the same, right? So really ways to sort of bring this together, those kind of 3, 4 key findings you're looking for, which points to the value of not just having those isolated conversations, but now pulling out like over several conversations. What are the themes? What are the patterns that you're finding? And using those to tell a larger story. And this is tricky, which is why it's so helpful to have someone to talk about this with, right? Like who's also doing the interviews with you in a team. And you can have this conversation of, hey, what are you finding? Is this a pattern that you're noticing? And then you can kind of layer that out and sort of determine what are these big buckets that are just good context that everyone should know as a sort of, if you're summarizing all the findings, what are the key findings that your leaders need to know? That's going to be a really helpful way to approach this.
You make it sound so easy. Just find the biggest key findings, you know?
It's
But
tough.
it's really
It
tough.
really is.
And I think
It
that
really
people
is.
do
Yeah.
struggle. They struggle with the smaller findings because those are
Hmm.
a bit easier, right? It's like, oh, I don't know. People prefer strawberry over blueberry in,
Right, right, right.
whatever flavor. Uh, that's an easy one to pull out. But to then
Yeah.
layer that up to the business objective and say, like you said, these segments are so vastly different, and that is the thing we need to be aware of as a business or whatever. Like
Hmm.
those require a lot more critical thinking to get to.
Yeah, and I'll say this that might help kind of hopefully normalize some of the process. So this is by no means easy and or quick. Right? When I'm working with a client, this analysis phase will take me a good like 2.5 weeks where I'm just sitting with the data. I'm analyzing it. I might look for specific patterns like, okay, these are all the pain points, or these are all the objections, and I'll kind of just list them out and have counts beside them. But once you have that sort of patch done of how many benefits and how many people have said X, that's when you want to sit with it and stew. So you've got all of the smaller findings. Now just kind of take a look and look at that holistically. It's a core step that people miss, but then you get stuck in the smaller findings and you don't see the larger narrative. So taking all the small findings, sit with them, distill them, and look at what's happening. Are all of different industries speaking differently or speaking similarly across? You'll start to see patterns when you look at all of that data analyzed versus when you're just looking at all the data. So you want to keep like chiseling it down and distill it a bit more so that the patterns have room to surface. So it's absolutely not easy. It's a very muddy, messy process, but it is possible. You do need to kind of keep chipping away, and then you'll start to kind of notice. The other thing I would say too is that when you're doing the interviews yourself, you build a bit of a sense of like what's important, even if you haven't heard it multiple times yet, because you are talking to the customer. There's a level of insight that you have there just by being in the conversation itself versus like reading the transcript. So trust that the goal is to sort of fact check what you're finding with the data, but trust the ideas and sort of like, oh, that was a really interesting thing that they said. I didn't expect that. Or, oh, okay, the other guy said that too. Those are going to be really key for you to sort of check when you're rolling up the key findings for leadership. Those kind of gut responses, because there's
Mhm.
an intimacy with the data that you have that's going to be really, really useful there. So just a couple of pointers to help hopefully like clear up some of the murkiness of that analysis process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece you just said about kind of balancing the data with the gut feel, man, that is
Mhm.
tricky because I mean, we come across it all the time in our business, and
Yeah.
when we're trying to make strategic decisions of what direction the company should go in, like you have to rely a portion on gut feel and your
Yeah.
experience, and some of it isn't as data driven as you'd like it to be, and
Yeah.
that can be a hard place to live. And so having that
Hmm.
that really strong combination of like, here's my gut feel, let's design some research to validate that, or
Yeah.
this is what I'm feeling in the moment as I'm doing my analysis. Was that accurate? Do I have data to support that gut feel? Is so important, but it's hard. It's really hard
Yeah.
to, as you were talking about, like that you take like 2.5 weeks to like sit with the data. It really speaks to, we have so many conversations in the industry about agile and really quick timelines,
Hmm.
and you do have the ability to get results in a matter of hours from a bunch of different
Hmm.
methodologies,
Yep.
quant, qual. You could have instant access to shopper data or
Yep.
social data or whatever, but there is a difference between data and insight, and really being able
Yeah.
to answer those questions. And that does take time, sometimes, more than others. And maybe there's something really obvious that you can learn very quickly. And sometimes it
Yeah.
does take a little longer to marinate in it and see where
Yeah.
your gut takes you on it, right?
Yeah, I call it gut data because I think there's such a like there's voice of customer and then there's like the voice of the gut, right? Like the customer is just one spoke. It isn't like this is exactly what we should do. It's okay, this is what's happening. How do we want to react to it? And so gut data is so important, right? Because there is an attunement that you have across customers, across the industry, across the space that you need to marry with that voice of customer. So I totally hear you, and I think there's like I'm going to be shining that gut or waving that gut data flag for a while there too.
Absolutely. And you know what else? I mean, it speaks to like, I mean, some of that gut feel comes from other research that's already been done.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, Henrik. He's been so quiet. Um, but you know, as you're talking about data, the results, the answers can't live in a silo all on their own. If everyone's been communicated with effectively up until this point, then that information is valuable too. Not that you're going back and analyzing it again or comparing it, but you've got that experience with those customers and that segment to say, wow, this is really quite different from the study we did a year ago or whatever. And you just kind of know that stuff and over time build up a deeper connection with your customers and more empathy that is less about the specific question you've asked and more just about that connection with and understanding for those people.
Yeah, exactly like that. You keep building that foundation, right? Like the team learning of the whole team grows. Not in the silos, not because of that one question, but just additional research, additional insights, keep furthering and building that understanding. And then the conversations you have internally are so different too. But they're all coming from that same source of insight, which really kind of tightens and anchors a lot of the looseness of a conversation, especially in more innovative companies, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today. This has been a really fun conversation and a kind of a different angle to what we normally talk about. So I appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much. I love chatting about this stuff. So I had a ton of fun, and really, really enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll be back with another episode next week when I will be joined by Elena Lirinces of Google. See you then.